So in this video, we're going to start our study of the history of the English language. This is a study that's going to take us a couple weeks to complete. First of all, because English has a pretty long history, and because we're interested in finding all the places where English shows commonalities with the classical languages, its relationship with them. We're also looking for historical moments of influence with the classical languages and their descendants, and how English is grabbing words from them at different times for different reasons. So we're starting our study of this, though, with the earliest earliest ancestor of the English language. And before we dive into that, I want to talk a little bit about ideas like family trees and relationships between languages. So, the first thing we should note is languages change constantly. They're sometimes talked about as being living things because there is a constant process that goes on in a spoken language where words are picked up, as we know. They're lost. There are words that become obsolete and no one says them anymore. There are words that are replaced with new words, right? So languages change constantly. And over time, those changes can be significant enough that the language is considered to be different now. And it may be that this is a new phase of the same language. We'll see, for instance, that Old English appears on the scene sometime around the 500s to 700s AD. But by the 11th century AD, right, we're talking about the 1000s here, English has changed so much that we no longer call it Old English. It's now a new phase. This is Middle English, and it's very distinct from Old English in a lot of ways. It's just over that time, little by little, changed so much. In other cases, those changes mean that we now have entirely new languages. And so the case of Latin, which we'll look at more closely, is good here. The Latin language, because it was the language of the Romans, who had a pretty big empire across Europe, was spoken throughout a large swath of Europe. But as the Roman Empire came out of power, it declined, that language was started to change over time. And it changed in different ways in different regions of Europe. And so as Latin died, these new languages, what are known as daughter languages, were born from it. And this includes Italian is the form that was spoken in the Italian peninsula, French is the form that was spoken in France, Spanish and Portuguese over in the Iberian Peninsula, Romanian, over there in more Central Europe. And so these are distinct languages from Latin, but they are what we call daughters. They evolved out of Latin. It's just an example where Latin had changed so much it became a new language. So when we have a group of languages that are all descended from a common ancestor, there was one ancestor and it changed over time at different times in different places to build new languages, new descendants, new daughters, we call that a language family, right? It's the group of languages that are all descended from a common ancestor. So one of the jobs of linguists, who are the scholars who specialize in the study of human language, one of their jobs is to identify what are these families, who belongs to each family, what is the relationship, the exact relationship between the members of this family. How do they go about doing this? Well, it's a lot of what we call comparative work. They're looking at languages and they're trying to find what is similar. They're looking for similarities in the vocabulary, especially like the native or core vocabulary, those really basic everyday words like the pronouns and the basic verbs and really basic words like mother, father, body, house, because those are less likely to change over time. They also look at grammar, the actual grammatical constructions. How do you build a sentence? How do you express action? How do you express the subject and the object? Those kinds of constructions as well. And when two languages have an incredible amount of similarity between them, it suggests they probably come from a common language, right? They both inherited these words and these grammatical structures from a common ancestor. So we're going to look at Indo-European languages and the Indo-European language family tree specifically because that's the family tree that English belongs to. So for many centuries, people who had lived in Europe and spoke European languages had noticed that a lot of those languages had a lot of similarities. A lot of words especially were very similar across different European languages. But the sort of the study of this language family kicks off with a guy named Sir William Jones. So he's born in England and he was a trained historian. He could read both ancient Greek and Latin. And then he was stationed in India because the British took over and were ruling India and brought in British officers to fill different positions. And while he was in India, because he's a historian and he had that interest, he studied Sanskrit, which is an ancient language of northern India. And he realized as he studied Sanskrit, this is incredibly similar to Latin and to ancient Greek, even though it is spoken in a very different, farther away part of the world than Greece and Rome. And so he noticed a lot of similarities, again, including vocabulary and grammar. In terms of vocab, when we look at the words for father, in Latin it's pater, in ancient Greek it's pater, and in Sanskrit it's pitar. Very similar. When we look at grammar, so he noticed that there are these things called verbal endings. We'll get more into those in another lecture. And the endings for present tense verbs in ancient Greek, we have me, si, ti, and in Sanskrit we have me, si, ti. Identical. That is too similar to really be a coincidence. I mean, maybe, but it's unlikely. And so he began to think, these must come from the same language. They have to be related. And so his work is built on over time. Linguists study this phenomenon. They added in many more languages that they thought showed the same similarities. And they built a family tree of what they suspected to be languages that all had the same ancestor. And so we said the family is called Indo-European. And this is I will say, a simplified version of that family tree. It probably looks very complex. I have not gotten even a small fraction of all the languages that belong on this thing. So from this ancestor, we see that over time, people split into different groups. They moved to different areas, and the language changed in those different places and in those different groups. And so we see one group goes off into Eastern Europe, and they develop a Balto-Slavic language. And then there's even more changes. Over time, it really splits into two groups, the Baltic speakers and the Slavic speakers. And the Baltic speakers develop into languages like Latvian and Lithuanian, whilst the Slavic speakers have even more splits until we have like Eastern Slavic, like Russian, or Southern Slavic, like Bulgarian. The important branch for us, some of this people from this ancestor group came to Germany, and they developed a Germanic language, which then split based on different groups and different regions. We got a North Germanic group. They were up in Scandinavia, from which we get Swedish and Norwegian, and those kinds of things. A West Germanic group, that's us here. This is English, German, Dutch is in there. And an East Germanic group, it's Gothic, it's dead. We're done with that. Some of the people from this ancestor group made it over to the British Islands, and they developed a Celtic language, which again then splits. We've got Gaelic, which is like Irish, and Brythonic, which includes Welsh and a lot of dead languages. Some went to Albania and created Albanian. Some went to Italy and made the Italic language, which evolves into Latin, which evolves ultimately into its daughters, French, Spanish, Italian, and so forth. Some came to Armenia and made Armenian. Some of these people ended up in Greece and developed the Hellenic languages, which include Greek, really just Greek. Some went down into the region of modern Iran and northern India, and they developed the Indo-Iranian language, which then split. Some people went over to India, and we have the Indic languages, which include Sanskrit and its modern descendants, which aren't numerous, but include Hindi and Bengali. Some went down into modern, like Iran, and developed the Iranian languages, which again split, and we've got ones like Persian, Baluchi, and Kurdish. And some actually went all the way over to what's modern Western China, and they developed Tocharian. So the English language belongs to a much bigger family, and it is related to all these languages, including our classical languages, right? Latin and Greek, at least we're very interested in the ancient form of this, are kind of, we could call them cousins. The technical term is cognates. Right, which I don't have a lot of space here left, but cognates, they're related, they're from the same family. And so there's similarities between these languages already. So when a linguist wants to construct a tree like this, like I said, they look for commonalities. And as they go along and try to see, well, where did these splits happen? When did these groups break apart? One of the things that they look for is changes or differences. So they're not just looking at the similarities, they are also looking for the differences. And so over here, we're going to try to move over to this board. I have some examples of the word mother in a couple different Indo-European languages. We have Albanian, moter, Ancient Greek, meter, Armenian, mer, Avestan, which is an Iranian language, matar, English is mother, Latin is mater, Old Church Slavonic, which is a Slavic language, is mati, Old Irish is mathir, Sanskrit is matar, and then you can't see it down here, but Tocharian is machar. So really similar, right? It's clear that these must have come from the same ancestor, ultimately. But there are also some differences. So they all start with M. They all start kind of with an A-ish sound, I will say. But then we have a T in most of them with some exceptions. Armenian is mer, and that Tocharian one down at the bottom is machar, makar. So there's no T. And so the fact that they don't have it suggests to linguists that maybe at an early phase, some group split off, and among that group was the Armenian and Tocharian speakers, and so they lost the use of the T or TH sound. Another split we could see is most of these have a T sound, a couple of TH, English and Old Irish, and so that's another split we can guess, right? That some group split off and they went with a TH sound instead of a T sound. So by looking at the similarities and the differences between all of these words that they collect from the Indo-European languages, they can start to reconstruct which languages are more closely related, what splits happened over time, and so on. Now, you can also work backwards. So we'll go back to our family tree. You can also work backwards and try to get back to this ancestor. Right? So by looking at all of the examples of a word across the different Indo-European languages and considering what's similar about it and what changes you know about that probably came later, you can try to reconstruct what the original form of the word was in the ancestor language. So from all of the examples of mother, and some more, scholars have reconstructed that probably the original form of that word was mater, right? Which combines the features of the word that are most widespread across the languages, the M, the A sound, the T, the R at the end as well. So it probably started out as a word quite like mater, right? And then experienced different changes over time as we experience different groups. Okay, I dropped my notes. So ultimately, linguists who work on the Indo-European family have put together the basics of what they believe to be the ancestor language to all of the languages in the Indo-European family tree. They call this language Proto-Indo-European, and they believe it was probably spoken around 6,000 years ago. We're going to look more closely at Proto-Indo-European and its features in our next lecture. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.